In 1963, Enzo Ferrari said something that would cost him dearly. He didn't say it quietly. He didn't say it in private. He said it the way a man says something when he believes, without question, that he is right, and that no one in the room has the standing to disagree. American cars, he declared, were built for straight lines and simple people. They were loud, crude, and fundamentally incapable of competing at the highest levels of motorsport. Europe had the engineering. Europe had the heritage. And Ferrari, sitting comfortably at the top of that world, had nothing to fear from anyone west of the Atlantic. The press loved it. The paddock laughed along. Nobody corrected him. But in a workshop far from Maranello, without the cameras, without the prestige, and without a single person outside that room believing it was possible, a group of American engineers was quietly building something that would make Enzo Ferrari very uncomfortable. You probably haven't heard this story. Most people haven't. Not because it isn't remarkable, but because the people who built this engine never needed the credit. They only needed the clock. So, what exactly did they build? And did it ever actually embarrass the most powerful name in racing history? Stay with this, because the answer is not what you expect. To understand why what happened next matters, you first have to understand what Ferrari actually was in the early 1960s. Not the brand, not the cars, the institution. Enzo Ferrari had built something that went far beyond a racing team. He had built a mythology. Maranello was less a factory and more a cathedral, and Enzo was its high priest. Journalists travelled from across Europe just to sit in his office. Drivers begged for seats on his team, knowing he would work them half to death and take full credit for every victory. And they did it anyway. Because a Ferrari contract wasn't just a job, it was a coronation. On the track, the numbers backed the legend completely. Through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, Ferrari had accumulated Le Mans victories, Formula One championships, and a competitive record that made the rest of the field look like they were racing in a different sport. The prancing horse wasn't just winning, it was lapping the concept of competition itself. And the wider European racing establishment had quietly accepted this order of things. Ferrari was at the top. A handful of British and German teams competed for whatever scraps remained. Everyone else was essentially decorative. What made this dominance so suffocating wasn't just the results. It was the infrastructure behind them. Ferrari had the engineers, the testing facilities, the institutional knowledge built across decades of elite motorsport. They understood aerodynamics, weight distribution, and high-revving engine architecture at a level that had taken years of painful, expensive iteration to develop. You could not simply arrive and compete with that. You needed time, money, and, perhaps most importantly, a reason to believe it was even worth attempting. Which is exactly what Enzo Ferrari had just given someone. Because arrogance, at scale, creates a very specific kind of blind spot. It causes you to stop watching the people you've already decided don't matter. And in 1963, Ferrari had completely stopped watching America. The engine didn't begin as a revolution. It began as a conversation nobody wanted to have. American performance engineering in the early 1960s occupied a very specific and very limited space in the global imagination. It meant displacement. It meant torque. It meant long hoods and loud exhausts and quarter-mile drag strips on Friday nights. It did not mean Le Mans. It did not mean precision. And it absolutely did not mean Ferrari. That assumption was so deeply embedded in the culture of motorsport that even within America, the people who might have challenged it were slow to try. The resources weren't there. The institutional credibility wasn't there. And perhaps most damagingly, the belief wasn't there either. Not in any boardroom, not in any racing committee, not anywhere that mattered, except in a handful of rooms where a handful of engineers had stopped asking for permission. What drove these men wasn't corporate strategy. It wasn't a marketing brief or a sponsorship opportunity. It was something closer to obsession, the particular kind that takes hold when a person becomes convinced that everyone around them is wrong about something important. They looked at the European philosophy of small, high-revving, surgically precise engines, and they didn't see superiority. They saw a different set of trade-offs, and they believed, genuinely, stubbornly believed, that their approach could be engineered into something capable of competing on the same stage. The philosophy was blunt by European standards. Displacement over delicacy. Raw torque channeled through increasingly sophisticated engineering. Where Ferrari refined, these men pushed. Where European designers carved away material in pursuit of elegance, the American team leaned into mass and power and asked a different question entirely. Not how do we make this lighter, but how do we make this unstoppable? The budget was a fraction of what Ferrari spent on a single season. The timeline was brutal. The testing conditions were improvised in ways that would have made the Maranello engineers wince. And every time early results showed genuine promise, the response from the outside world was some version of the same dismissal, polite at best, contemptuous at worst. But the data inside that room told a different story. The engine was getting faster. The reliability numbers were climbing. And the gap between what the European establishment believed was possible from an American power plant and what was actually happening on the dyno was closing in a way that nobody outside that workshop had any idea about. Which was, as it turned out, exactly the right position to be in. Because the most dangerous thing you can be, in motorsport, in business, in almost anything, is the person that the person at the top has already decided isn't worth watching. There is a moment in every underdog story where the narrative stops being about belief and starts being about proof. For this engine, that moment came on a strip of tarmac that most people outside the project had never heard of, in conditions that were far from ideal, with a stopwatch that was about to become the most important object in the room. The team knew what they needed. Not a perfect run. Not a showroom performance. They needed numbers that could survive scrutiny, lap times, thermal data, sustained output figures that held together not just for one pass, but across the kind of extended punishment that endurance racing actually demanded. Ferrari didn't just win races. Ferrari won races at hour 14, when every other engine on the circuit was already making sounds it shouldn't be making. If this American power plant couldn't demonstrate that kind of durability under controlled conditions, everything else was irrelevant. The first runs were promising, more than promising. The team ran the numbers again, then again. Not because they doubted the results, but because they understood exactly what those results meant, and they needed to be certain before they allowed themselves to react. What the data showed was this. Under sustained load, across conditions designed to simulate the thermal and mechanical stress of a long-distance race, the engine was performing at a level that placed it, conservatively, carefully, without any favorable interpretation of the margins, within genuine striking distance of what Ferrari was producing in the same class. Not ahead, not definitively, but close enough that the word close no longer felt like consolation. It felt like a threat. The reaction inside the room was not celebration. It was something quieter and more serious than that. These were engineers. They understood that a good test session and a good race were separated by approximately 1,000 ways for everything to go wrong. But they also understood that they had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The question was no longer whether this engine could compete at the highest level. The question was whether the people running the sport would ever allow the result to be what the data suggested it should be. Word began to move. Carefully, selectively, but it moved. In the way that genuinely dangerous information always moves, through back channels and quiet conversations and the particular body language of people who know something they aren't supposed to know yet. And somewhere in Europe, in the circles where Ferrari's reputation functioned less like a brand and more like a standing order, people started asking questions about what exactly was being built in America and whether anyone had bothered to take it seriously. Enzo Ferrari had not. That was about to become a problem. This is the part of the story where it would be easy to exaggerate, to say the American engine arrived, shook the world, and sent Ferrari scrambling back to Maranello with its tail between its legs. That version is cleaner, it's more satisfying, and it's exactly the kind of story that gets told when people care more about the legend than the truth. But the truth is more interesting than the legend. It almost always is. What actually happened was this, and the margins matter, so pay attention to them. When the engine was placed into genuine competitive context, against machinery that had been refined across years of elite-level racing, it did not win cleanly. It did not dominate. What it did was something that, given every constraint surrounding its creation, was arguably more extraordinary than a clean victory would have been. It competed. Genuinely, measurably, uncomfortably competed. In ways that forced the people on the Ferrari side of the paddock to look at data they had not expected to be looking at and make calculations they had not expected to be making. Lap time comparisons told part of the story. The American engine was not being lapped. It was not an embarrassing footnote in the results. It was close enough that the margin between it and Ferrari's output in equivalent conditions sat inside the range that racing people describe, with careful understatement, as a setup problem, meaning the gap was small enough that it could be attributed to variables other than the engine itself. Aerodynamics, weight, driver, track conditions. The kind of gap that, with one more development cycle, one more season, one more iteration of the engineering, had a realistic chance of closing entirely. Ferrari's resource advantage was, in the end, the honest answer to why the result landed where it did. Not superiority of concept, not a fundamental flaw in the American approach. Resources, time, the accumulated infrastructure of an institution that had been doing this longer and with more support than the team across the Atlantic could reasonably match in the time frame they had been given. That distinction matters enormously, because there is a profound difference between losing because your idea was wrong and losing because you ran out of runway before the idea could fully become what it was capable of being. The engineers knew the difference. The data knew the difference. And in the quiet, honest conversations that happened in the paddock after the results were tallied, away from the press, away from the official narrative, a small number of people on the European side of that competition knew the difference too. Ferrari had not been beaten, but Ferrari had been warned. And that, in 1963, was something almost nobody had managed to do. This is the part where it would be easy to exaggerate, to say the American engine arrived and sent Ferrari scrambling back to Maranello humiliated. That version is cleaner, more satisfying, and it's exactly the story that gets told when legend matters more than record. But the record is more interesting, so let's be precise. The Ford GT40 made its Le Mans debut in 1964. All three entries retired before the finish. On paper, that looks like confirmation of everything Ferrari had been saying. Crude, unreliable, not ready. Except the engine wasn't the reason those cars stopped racing. Transmission failures, brake issues. the kind of mechanical attrition that punishes every new program in its first serious outing, regardless of origin. The V8 itself held together longer than pre-race predictions suggested it would. That detail was quietly overlooked. It usually is when results don't fit the narrative already in circulation. By 1965, the gap had compressed visibly. Ford returned with better preparation and a full season of hard data behind them. The GT40 qualified competitively, ran with the leaders, and pushed Ferrari into a defensive development response that consumed significant resources. Ferrari doubled its budget that winter. That is the most honest measure of how close it had gotten. You do not pour money into defending a position you are comfortable holding. You do it when something appears in your mirrors that was never supposed to be there. The American engine had not beaten Ferrari, but it had done something arguably harder. It had forced the most dominant team in motorsport to start worrying. And in 1963, nobody had thought that was possible. Enzo Ferrari never publicly acknowledged what had been built. Not the engineering, not the margin. Not the winter his team spent doubling its budget because something from America had appeared in the mirrors. He carried his silence on the subject with the same authority he carried everything else, completely and without apology. But the engineers in that workshop didn't need his acknowledgement. What they needed, they had already earned. The American performance industry that followed, the culture of pushing displacement into precision, of refusing the assumption that sophistication belonged exclusively to Europe, owes a quiet, largely uncredited debt to the people who built this engine when nobody believed it was worth building. The story stayed buried for decades, partly because they never chased the spotlight, partly because history tends to remember the trophy, not the team that made the winner nervous. But here is what stays with you after you learn it properly. The most dangerous competitor in any field is never the one everyone is watching. It's the one working quietly in a room nobody's visiting, building something the person at the top has already decided isn't worth worrying about. Enzo Ferrari decided that once. He only made that mistake once.